Uh, Thank you for recording. So the day three. So in March we have several events planned along with the Transforming Transportations event that's we usually co-organize with World Bank, which is this time is the 20-year anniversary. It's going to be on March 14th and 15th. It's a hybrid event, so even if you cannot join in person, you can come join us via the like a virtual link. And then as part of that, there's also this day three paratransit events where we are collaborating with World Bank, SSATP, and VREF, where we feature different meetings and information sections and workshop, and also the presentations for the paratransit days. Again, if you cannot join in person, the virtual link will be available soon. So then there are other events that DT4A partner only is attending on March 17th. So one of the activity that DT4A does on a regular basis is this monthly webinar where you all are here for. So this is a webinar series that we organize along with partners and WRI Africa. The goal is to facilitate knowledge exchange, showcasing different work that our partners and friends have been doing. So this this month we have Paolo, Yiyi, and Justin presenting. That's it from my side. We'll hand it to the group presenters. Justin, I believe.
Oh, sorry. I thought Paolo was going to do a little bit of an intro, but no worries.
Oh, yeah. Justin from GoMetro. So sorry. Yeah.
Okay. No, great. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you all. It's really great to see many familiar names and faces in our data collection community. It's very, very useful for us to, I think, have these sessions. So thank you very much for arranging them. I'm going to ask the quintessential question of, can you see my screen? Good, I see nods. So I'm just going to very briefly, in less than 7.5 minutes, introduce the data that was collected and how the methodology that was collected for this project. And then Paolo and Yiyi will give the overview of how this data was used. And I think it's more important that we focus on the analysis and how this data was used, because in the last few years of data collection that I've been involved in, this is probably one of the most interesting projects with regards to findings and learnings that really shows how data can be used to answer a host of mobility questions. So I think there is incredible value in the latter part of this talk, and mine is the very straightforward how we collected data. So we'll get through it quickly so we can get to the good stuff soon. So just a little bit about my organization, GoAscendal. It's a joint venture between GoMetro, a technology business, and the Ascendal Group, a public transport operator that brings operations and technology together to improve transport systems and use operational experience. About the study area, so the city of Kinshasa is the capital city of DRC. It is at the apex of the Congo Basin, and as you can see in this map, all waters lead to Kinshasa, and so it really is characterized by the Congo River, and therefore it's a city that's been shaped and built around a major water course. The first step that we did in entering the city, and something we do in any new city where we work in, is starting to categorize where the major hubs are, where the interchanges are, where the holding areas are, and also what types of modes operate in a city. It's not always just one particular mode. there might be a dominant mode, but if in this city, as in others, you had a range of from large buses to middle vans to cars to bikes, and the spectrum in between them was vast and wide. And so the first step was to identify the locations where each of these modes congregate in order for us to quantify a data collection exercise, and then try and get statistical sampling and network sampling from each of those particular nodes. So that's really how we started grappling with the question of what is the urban mobility mix. I think Kinshasa is a city that requires a lot more data collection. We could only really skim the surface with the time and budgets that we had. And certainly I would love to be able to deep dive into the network a lot further. So there are 5 main modes of informal or popular transport that operate in the city. We had 3 weeks we spent 3 weeks collecting the data with a focus on peak hour onboard data collection using a mobile app, accompanied by off-board observations. This was, I think, during the kind of peak of COVID in 2020, so project management was done remotely. However, we were very fortunate to have a Congolese national based at our head office who could mobilize his network and understood how things worked on the ground, which strongly facilitated a successful project delivery with a local team of supervisors and enumerators. So this was really done, you could say, literally down the wire as a project. So there were 2 phases to the data collection. So we tried to collect when it was dry. So when it was a dry day, there was no rains forecast, it was going to be normal traffic in a normal weekday. We tried to collect network information during that period as much as possible across the different modes. And when it was dry, we had a few challenges, like you do in any project. We had very long queues during the peak hours. We often couldn't board our enumerators because the demand was so high that our enumerators had to stand by the wayside. The peak hours started as early as 2 p.m. due to congestion. If there's one thing that we've learned about Kinshasa is that it is probably rivals Lagos with regards to congestion, if not beats Lagos some days, with regards to the levels of congestion, the waiting time, and the trip decisions that were made. We also found a few trips terminating oddly in that the driver would avoid the cops and avoid law enforcement, and therefore not necessarily behave as he normally would, but have a law enforcement break. And then the road conditions in the city would also mean that there was multimodal trips happening, in that you kind of do the main trip through a shared mode, and then you do the last leg on a moto because cars can't get down the road where you live or the neighborhood that you live in. And so there was a lot of, you could say, pavement engineering enforced multimodal travel that is I think replicated in a number of cities. There was some construction works, and we also struggled to board some vehicles, especially when there was huge demand, because there were passengers that wanted to pay to go. Everything that we did in the dry collection phase, we put into GTFS and standardized on a GTFS data set with shapefiles and the pursuant off-board frequency measurements. And then we also had a vehicle trip logbook that told us what happened on that vehicle on that day. So if there were anomalies, we were able to see what the enumerator had collected, which is how we would able to identify law enforcement induced deviations. What the result looked like was a network map of the city where you see 4 distinct modes: the Transco, Taxi Jaune, Esprit de Vie, and Esprit de Mort, and how each of these operate with an origin and destination node per district. So we also had a district view of the data that we collected, because from each district would be serviced from potentially different facilities. So this was our baseline data network that we collected. We then went back into the field when it had rained, and as soon as possible after a heavy rain event. So the dry was in perfect weather conditions. The wet was when it would either be very difficult to board, very difficult to queue. As you can see here, very difficult to drive through roads that have turned into a bit of a quagmire. The question was also, do services operate when it rains? Are there services that just pause, stop, and don't even bother trying to get people home after a rain event? And that was, I think you'll see in the analysis, a very interesting finding. So we were able to operate or survey 3 of the 5 modes in the wet conditions. The other 2 were just feasibly impractical and very challenging to get permission and cooperation during the rain or during the wet. You can imagine we're asking an operator during their most stressful operating times to work. And so it wasn't exactly always possible for us to collect after a rain event, as the city also just essentially tries to scramble to get home, because everyone knows it's going to take so much longer to get home, that the network was quite busy and engaged in moving. We also focused on areas that we knew were either prone to flooding, had road closures due to low water bridges, or a road network that is a challenge. And so we focused our attention on those parts of the network. And using the same team that conducted on the dry condition gave us also their logbooks and their insights as they were surveying, for us to understand ground conditions from the perspective of the rider. So here's just an example of after a heavy rain event, some of the trips forward and reverse for one of the modes, for one of the destinations. And then just to summarize, we ended up with a big data file with a number of routes in the wet and the dry, 5 modes that were collected, 5 in the dry, 3 of the 5 in the wet. The Transco we found didn't operate in the wet because the rains turned to mud, and motor taxis were a challenge to work with in the wet conditions to try and get data collected on them. So that was how we went and collected the data. It was very interesting, I think, to have almost like dispatch mapping, that you're waiting for it to rain and then you send out people. So that was a challenging scenario to handle. But I think it's really important that we're able to start diagnosing and start measuring our cities using our tools to understand the phenomena that we're experiencing. So it was a really great opportunity for us to collect data. So over to Paolo and Yiyi, who I think will take us through what they did with the data once it was collected.
Thanks a lot, Justin. Yes, maybe I should have introduced you, but I don't actually think you need much introduction to this group, so I just let you go with it. So hopefully you can see my slides. Yes, okay, I'm seeing people noting. So yes, I mean, this project really came. So okay, first let me say introduce myself. So I'm Paolo Avner. I'm a senior economist. I'm a senior economist in the World Bank, and I work in a unit which is called GFDR, which stands for the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. So really, the focus of this unit is to work on and think about resilience and disaster risk management. So that's one, also you're going to see the focus of this project. This was work that's now turned into a paper. There was joint work with Yiyi, who is going to present a little bit later, but also Stéphane Thiès, who was a consultant at the World Bank at the time and has now gone on to do bigger and better things and is working on a PhD. And my good colleague June Wenchler, who was also in GFDR at the time. So this work really aims to measure the physical and economic impacts of rainy season flooding on transport services and employment accessibility, right? And our case study is Kinshasa, but we're really interested in the findings more generally. So this is a picture.
Non, je suis seulement fatigué.
So, Christian, I think you might want to mute whilst I go through the slides. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, so this is a picture of a traffic jam that was caused by flooding in a city in Thailand. And as you can see, it looks very impressive. And it's kind of sufficient to bring the traffic to a near halt. But these types of events actually happen frequently after heavy rains in many locations around the world, and in Africa in particular. And we've recently done some work, looking at the historical trends of built-up expansion in flood-prone areas globally, but also for the African continent. And what we find as a general rule, of course, the large discrepancies, but what we find as a general rule is a pattern where risky urban growth, so urban growth which is happening in flood-prone areas where inundation depths are bigger than 15 centimeters, is outpacing what we call safe growth. And nowhere on the African continent is risky growth outpacing safe growth more than in DRC. So you have increased exposure of people and assets to floods because urbanization is increasingly taking place in flood-prone areas. In addition, you've got change in climate and weather patterns, which are increasing the frequency and intensity of flooding events in certain locations, and this is certainly true in Kinshasa. And you also have this combined with an insufficient capacity to mitigate the consequences of flooding. So think of, lack of drainage systems, which means that this increased exposure, which is coming from, people moving to flood-prone areas, assets being increasingly in flood-prone areas, but also, increased intensity of the flooding and frequency of the flooding, is actually going to translate into increased vulnerability. So let's start with the questions that we have, which really provide the motivation for this study. Floods occur regularly in Kinshasa, and not just in Kinshasa, in many other urban areas, but very little is actually known about the impacts on transport. At best, what we usually can know is how much direct damages floods cause to a transport infrastructure. So think of the repair cost of roads. But we really know very little about the indirect impacts or the indirect costs from floods when they disrupt the ability to conduct business as usual. So how do floods, for example, impact collective public transport times and itineraries? How did these transport disruptions impact the ability of people to reach jobs and key services? Can we put a value on these system-wide disruptions beyond the repair cost of the infrastructure itself? And can some of the analysis that we're going to perform, help uncover cost mitigation strategies? So can they help us prioritize where the most urgent transport work should be happening? So we're really not starting from nothing, and I'm sure this group is very aware of this, so I'll go quickly through this stuff. But accessibility studies, to employment and other key services have really become mainstream, including in developing countries. They typically now have become a mandatory analysis as part of World Bank urban transport operations. So they're embedded really into the World Bank system and operational work. And they've become much easier to conduct because of progress in three related areas. The first one, of course, and I'm not going to say anything that this group doesn't know, is there's been huge progress in mapping public collective transport modes, including informal ones in Africa and elsewhere. But there's also been a lot of progress in community road mapping through OpenStreetMap initiatives. The second one is that we've become really much better at navigating data scarcity. So one example here is, if we didn't have information about the distribution of jobs, kind of census information before, you couldn't say much about accessibility to employment in the urban area. But, there's been quite a lot of work, and we certainly participated at the World Bank and in GFDR to try to come up with proxies to predict the spatial distributions of jobs in urban areas when we don't have, underlying information from firm registries or business censuses. The last, I think, piece of area where we've made a lot of progress, and is really in network science computational techniques. So what used to be really costly and difficult to do is now something that we can do much quicker. And so here are just a couple of examples of what we've done recently in Africa, but lots of other people are doing excellent work elsewhere. So we were kind of, we did some work to kind of estimate the accessibility to employment in 11 cities in sub-Saharan Africa, which you're seeing on the left here, but we also did some work was looking at trying to quantify the inequality in accessibility levels. So we're making good progress on understanding accessibility, but really one big blind spot so far is understanding how this accessibility is affected by natural disasters and floods in particular. So to tackle this blind spot, we put together a methodology that quantifies various aspects of transport disruptions from floods. One important point to mention here is that all these analyses are conducted at the scale of the whole urban area. And this is really important because even very localized impacts on floods, on transport from floods, can actually have ripple effects throughout the urban economy and are going to propagate throughout the network. So as you can see on the right-hand side of this workflow chart, there's 3 distinct phases. First one is data collection, then processing and analysis, and the last one's outcomes and results, right? So nothing very new. But in terms of the data collection, what we do is we combine information on the transport infrastructure, itineraries and travel time with flood maps to produce multimodal transport networks under dry and flooded conditions. So the transport networks that we consider are both road and pedestrian networks from OpenStreetMap, but also the public transport networks. And you had Justin before present how data collection went. So really importantly, and I think this is really the key point, is that the work that Justin and GoMetro did is really the bedrock for this analysis, right? It's the ability to measure travel times and how the public transport network is affected under both dry and flooded conditions. So we then also combine these transport networks with information from households or commuter surveys, which gives us some information at the personal or household level about travel patterns, transport mode use, but also importantly incomes. So these surveys are not always available, so we got really lucky here, but when they are, they really enrich the analysis considerably. So second step is that we process this information and we're then in a position to produce a series of analysis. So let me. So first we can actually measure the impacts of floods on the transport networks themselves. So which road segments become impassable, how are travel times affected, what public transport modes are going to operate or will not operate, that kind of information. Second, we can actually assess the impacts of floods on the ability of people to reach jobs and key services, and this is the impact on accessibility. We can also provide information on which are the most critical links in the urban area as a whole. And this is an important dimension because it can start to get to you to, where in a city should you be prioritizing investments, for example, to climate-proof your network or to boost the resilience of your transport networks. And the last item here is we can provide some information on the economic costs of travel disruptions from floods through kind of monetizing, if you want, the travel time increases. So this is really going to be a lower bound of what flood disruptions do to the urban economy, but it's definitely a starting point. So again, drawing your attention to really the bedrock of this analysis, which is the ability to have information on the public transport networks under both dry and flooded conditions, right, that Justin presented. I think this is quite innovative. I don't think I've seen this elsewhere yet, or at least at the time of this study, because we now published this about 2 years ago. And it's really a critical part for the subsequent work that we're going to do. So let's start going through very briefly what data we used, right? So in Kinshasa, we were really lucky because we got access to a commuter survey that was collected by JICA in 2018. And this JICA survey provides us information on where people live, where people work, so the origin destination patterns, how much they earn, so the incomes of the households or the individuals, and how they commute to work, which modes of transport do they use. And so based on this information, we can start to get an idea of travel flows in the urban area and, whether we have some socioeconomic patterns that emerge. So for example, do the poorest travel far or not? Where do they live, etc., etc. The second key piece of information that we rely on is a good picture of the transportation networks, right? So again, for pedestrians and car travel, we relied on the OpenStreetMap network, and we had to make some assumptions about travel speeds. For the public transport network, we, as you know by now, we work with GoMetro to map the various public transport modes, and they produce these in GTFS formats, reporting travel times between stops, the itineraries, and we were able to use these to infer speeds on the network. And this was done, of course, under dry and wet conditions. So Justin alluded to this, but we have 5 different transports, or collective, if you want, or public transport modes in Kinshasa. There's Transco, which is really the most formal public bus service in Kinshasa. There were about 40 routes in 2020. The second one is the Esprit de Vie, so minibus taxis that have a capacity of up to 22 seats. Then you have the Esprit de Mar, which are larger taxis. As the name for French speakers, and I am French, like me, Esprit de Mar, I mean, the name is, kind of signifies that this is, slightly more dangerous than the Esprit de Vie. You've got the yellow cabs, les taxis jaunes, that can, have a capacity of up to 4 passengers. And then the motor taxis. And the motor taxis, the data collection from GoMetro was really kind of not necessarily mapping a whole network of the motor taxis, but really focusing on motor taxis as a service to link, between 2 hubs where, the main other vehicles couldn't actually pass because the roads were too narrow or the conditions insufficient. The last piece of information that we use for this analysis are flood maps. These are global. The ones that we use are global flood maps that are produced by a company called Phasm. They are global in nature, which means that you don't have the same granularity or same precision that you have with really, highly expensive localized flood maps, but they're really state of the art when it comes to, global flood maps. And they provide information for both pluvial and fluvial mapping, which are both very important in Kinshasa. They're available for various return periods, which corresponds, for those that are not familiar with flood maps, to different intensities of flooding. And we use the 10, 50, 100, 500, and 1,000 year return periods. So from quite regular flooding to very rare but very intense and very dramatic flooding in our analysis. And these maps come at a 90-meter spatial resolution. So I will now pause here and actually give the floor to Yiyi, who may want to introduce herself before. And Yiyi, if you want, I can just pass the slides for you if you give me the go.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Paolo. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Yiyi. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. Did my master's and PhD at UC Berkeley, and that's the time when I met June and Paolo and started working on this project. My main research interest, it would be understanding the impact of climate change extremes on critical infrastructure networks. And this is one of my favorite projects to work on, and I'm very glad. So with that, I'm hoping to talk about the analysis that we did. First of all, I would like to discuss the impact of pluvial and fluvial flood hazard on public transit network in the city of Kinshasa. In general, there are 3 ways that floods could impact commuters' travel from home to work. And the first one is reduction in the frequency of travel services. The second one is changes in travel itineraries. And the third one is reduction in travel speeds. So based on our data analysis, we find that the Transco bus service does not operate at all under the flooded conditions. As for the other transportation modes, we observe increases in mean headways. So if I could draw your attention to the smaller figures at the bottom of the slide, I show examples of the changes in travel itineraries. The red line represents travel itinerary under dry conditions, and the blue represents travel itineraries under flooded conditions. Next slide, please. The first two types of impact can be extracted relatively easily from the innovative GTFS dataset collected for the purpose of this study. However, the impact of floods on travel speed is really hard to determine for the entire public transport network, because first of all, the wet season mapping only surveyed a 28% sample of all operating routes. And second, even for these routes, it is difficult to do a one-on-one comparison of speed because many of the itineraries change. So we implemented a matching method to understand the impacts of speed on road segments that were mapped under both dry and wet conditions. And the results are reported in the table, and we find reduced speed to various degrees for SV de Moor and SV de V and Taxi Jean. Sorry, I'm probably abusing the pronunciation of these transportation modes. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. In addition, I hope to highlight the pattern that we observed with regard to socio-spatial equity. So after computing the GI star statistic, or better known as the hotspot analyses, for commuters' travel time between home and work, and their income based on the survey that we had from JICA, we observe a huge divergence in the analysis outcomes. The southeastern and northeastern suburban areas show clusters of low income values, yet high travel times, while the northern region near Congo River shows the opposite pattern. So this result really speaks to socio-spatial equity concerns, as certain low-income areas are systematically disadvantaged in terms of job accessibility and economic opportunities. Next slide, please. So now turning into how floods impact accessibility to employment, we measure it as a share of jobs that can be reached within 1 hour. To achieve this, we first built the network by the wet network, by removing the Transco bus routes because it doesn't really operate under flooded conditions. And then second, we adjust travel speeds according to our previous results, and also the public transport frequencies as discussed before. We also remove transport links that are flooded by more than 20 centimeter floodwater inundation. We present our results for each of the 3 transport modes in the maps and then on the table on the slide. So starting with the maps, we can see a clear difference in spatial patterns. The loss of access for pedestrians is the highest in the north, to the east, and west of the city center. The loss of access for cars is mainly concentrated in the outskirts of the city to the east. The loss of access to public transport is mainly concentrated in the city center of Kinshasa. And turning to the table, we can see that pedestrians are, on average, not very affected by floods because it is always possible to find alternative routes for non-flooded roads because of the network density for pedestrian routes. Cars experience a significant impact, and accessibility remains still very high. The most affected are the users of public transport. Their average accessibility decreases by 25%, from being able to reach 20% of the jobs within 1 hour to 15%. Thank you. The third part of the analysis investigates road criticality. So a highly critical road segment is that if it is impassable, then a lot of consequences might bring to the people's ability to travel from home to their workplaces. And criticality analysis can therefore provide important information to prioritize road segments to benefit from resilience investments. And the map on the left shows road criticality based on between centrality from network science. Although this metric has many merits, but one of the drawbacks is that it is purely based on network topology and does not account for where people live and work. A bridge would more often than not be considered as highly critical, irrespective of whether or not we use it in practice. So for these reasons, we implemented a modified version of between centrality metric, which weighs road segments higher when they're used more often. The result is a list of road segments which are ranked by how critical they are. Local decision makers could then use this information to list and prioritize their resilience investments. Let's finally turn to the last part of our analyses, which focuses on attaching a dollar value to the disruptions of floods. We do so by multiplying the travel delays in minutes and by the income of commuters per minute. And this is classically known as the opportunity cost of time. We apply this to all 5 flood return periods considered in this study. And as seen on the map on the left, this provides us with a daily opportunity cost of travel delays for each flood return period. And they range from $5 million to for a 10-year flood to more than $14 million for a 1,000-year flood event. And the annualized average accounting for flood event probability is $1 million per day. And this sum is large, but nonetheless important to keep in mind that it's just a fraction of cost to floods because there are many disruptions to the infrastructure itself and also disruptions to a supply chain. Next slide, please. So with the information that we have so far, it is possible to disaggregate the travel delays and opportunity costs by income group. The travel delays on the top and the opportunity costs on the bottom, so unsurprisingly, increase with flood return periods. The travel delays have a slightly inverted U-shaped curve, with travel delays being the highest for the residents whose income is between $300 and $750. And the opportunity costs show a different pattern as they ambiguously increase with incomes, despite the highest earners not experiencing the highest travel delays. And the value of these is large. And to our conclusions, it is definitely a privilege to work with the dual conditioned GTFS transit mapping under both dry and wet conditions, and combined with other data sets that we collected for this study, this information can be leveraged to shed on the loss of employment accessibility from rainy season flood events, the most critical transport links in the network, and then finally the evaluation of economic loss through community delays from floods. And we do see the many potentials of applying a similar methodology to other locations in Kinshasa or in Kigali or other places and cities around the world, actually. And yeah, I think in the future, we see great potential of applying some of the metrics like identified in the study, like criticality analyses to prioritize resilience investment, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, I'm going to conclude the study that we did for Kinshasa, and we welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
I think there's some questions about data availability. So this data is public. By the way, I should mention that the work that we did here in Kinshasa, we also partnered and did a very similar study and a similar data collection in Kigali. This data for these 2 cities, so in both dry and flooded conditions, is public. There's been a little bit of kind of back and forth with legal in the World Bank, because I wanted to actually share these with DT4A, but the World Bank is a little scared that they become, if you want, liable in terms of their responsibility for putting data which is data out there which might not be perfectly reflective of the conditions at the moment, right? So there's been a bit of back and forth, but I think we've converged to having the green light to sorry, to share these. So happy to share the data sets with I don't know, maybe it's you, Harry, or someone else. Oops, I lost the okay.
Jackie has a couple of questions. Maybe you can ask, and then yeah. Jackie.
Oh yeah, great. Hey Paolo, so nice to see you. And thanks also for being willing to share the data. That's a long-standing conversation we've been having. And I think you can put caveats and riders on the data when you share it, if that helps. But I was curious about the variability of the flooding at the street level, and hence the variability of some of the routes when, when you get different extreme raining. And I'm also curious, what that means in the future when we can get more real-time GTFS for these cities, or any city actually, that we can start feeding this information to people so they know, which would maybe increase, people's ability to adapt as well, because they might know about where these new routes are. So I'm curious about that. And then I love that you're starting to put figures on the damages. And since you're at the World Bank, Paolo, I wonder, do you think we could actually start moving to a loss and damages framework and say the kind of adaptation money that's coming out of that should go into upgrades that we could actually measure through the kind of work you're doing, to see the reductions in the harm being done by these extreme weather events. But fabulous work. I think this is really important work. So kudos.
Thanks a lot, Jackie. Shall I go ahead and respond to this, and then move on to other question? Okay. So the question on it's good to see you, Jackie, too. The question on the variability of the flooding what are the impacts for the routes which are affected is a really good one, and it's not an easy answer. So we know that flooding in urban areas follows a specific patterns just because of the topography, right? So flooding that happens is likely to happen in certain areas. That said, you do have flood events, right? So the FASM maps that we were showing are something which are probabilistic, right? So they're kind of looking at the history of flood events somewhere and basically inferring what is the probability of one area of the city being flooded by this amount, by this flood depths, and this area of the city being flooded by this flood depths. But there's a slight discrepancy between a flood event, which could affect one specific area of the city or one specific street, versus the probabilistic flood map. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there that we had to work with. And the leap of faith that we made was that, this heavy rain event and this flooding event that we were measuring was kind of representative, or was one kind of a representative flood event. I'm working a lot with disaster risk management experts at the moment because I'm in GFDR. They of course, they have a lot of caveats for this kind of approach, because they really work with specific flood events. So that's on the first thing. So I think it's kind of there's a caveat to be done there. And what would that mean for specific routes? Are the routes that we saw being disrupted, would they systematically be disrupted, and would they systematically be disrupted in the same way? That's, again, we've made the leap of faith of saying that this event was representative, but ideally we go back and repeat this exercise, for very different types of heavy rain events. So I think that's the answer on that one. On the loss and damage question, I know the World Bank is thinking very hard about how it can, respond to these types of questions in an efficient way. For example, because this type of study, it took a bit of time. We did it as quickly as possible, and we had like stellar people like Yiyi and Stefan on the team. But it's not something that we can necessarily repeat in the aftermath of an event very quickly. So I don't know if this could be an input to the loss and damage, but there are also people, including in my team, that are really working on kind of standardizing damage assessments to infrastructure. So they don't necessarily get to the indirect impacts that we're trying to quantify here, but they do kind of capture more of the direct impacts of the actual damages to the assets and the infrastructure. And they've invested a lot, and the turnaround time is basically 2 weeks. And for example, they're the first damage assessment for the Turkey recent earthquake.
I guess 2 questions from GIF. It's like, I think some of them are already mentioned by Justin the presentation, but I think it's good to repeat on the recording screen. So you mentioned frequency data, which modes does it apply, and how consistent was that? That was the first question. How was travel behavior during water flood times, and were there changes in travel fares during these times? I imagine flood could increase the operating costs, and how these could be passed on to passengers.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but Justin, if you're still there, maybe it makes more sense for you to take this one, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, I think, bolt on to the question around the road segment flooding, our primary way to detect road segment flooding is if a route changes delineation for some segment. So, and the influence there could be a big puddle, but it also could be traffic or police or roadblocks or closures. It's the driver deciding to change from a normal dry route or routing to a wet routing. And so it is also slightly, it's not necessarily that he's changing direction just because the road was flooded. It could be because he thought he could find a quicker way in those current conditions. So just with regards to wet and dry behaviors, so what was interesting was the fares do change. And I mean, we had a bigger fare budget when it had rained than after, or in the dry conditions. So fares do go up. But also there's much less inclination for operators to put their vehicles on the road. And the hesitancy we found wasn't necessarily just, I'm going to get stuck, but also I can get crashed into. And so I want to preserve my assets, and it's not worth doing the job or doing the trip or doing the, whatever you're asking me to do, particularly with regards to the moto transfers that would rather just wait for things to dry up a little bit more before plowing into the mud. And also just make it passable. So further investigation, I think, would be very interesting to see how the system responds. So we were just looking at the network response and the travel behavior response across the network, but driver decision making is an area we did not investigate. Operators and the range of decisions they can make in such conditions around pricing or operating is also not something that we quantified. And is worth further investigation. But definitely across the whole population sample, our fare budget was higher in the flooding than in the dry. So we definitely did pay more for the same amount of trips, or at least actually fewer trips. We paid more for fewer trips in the wet condition.
Thank you. And then I guess Alice Johnson, do you want to ask the questions if you're here?
Yes, but I think it was answered during the presentation. I wanted to find out the indicators used in the network analysis. And I saw that it was the betweenness analysis, so that's fine. So, thank you very much.
Yiyi, do you want to comment on that? Because you used the betweenness centrality, but you also kind of made changes to that one, no? And to make it more relevant.
Yeah, of course. So in network science, there are different metrics to understand criticality, and betweenness is one of the most popular ones used in research. Basically, it tries to use a leverage network topology to understand which segments in the network are most critical. But as I mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation, that a big drawback of using betweenness centrality in this conventional way is that it assumes basically equal importance of row segments. It seems like every single node on the network could be a potential origin, and origin or destination, and that is often not the case in real life. So since we have this wonderful multimodal network model built for the city of Kinshasa, and we know the travel patterns of commuters, so we leverage that to be able to weight the different segments differently. And that provides us with a more realistic understanding of which road segments are actually important. And going back to combining this with the flood data that we had from Fathom, and this would really help us understand like what is the kind of the overlap between flood hazard and those most critical links. So thinking about the concept of urban acupuncture, can we invest in certain road segments that are being mostly traveled, and can that help us improve the commuting pattern overall under flooded conditions is what I think is very interesting coming out of this project.
And were there any other questions that we did not address? I see that Clayton has his hands up, but I don't know if other people also.
Yeah, I think it's Clayton's time. Thanks for being patient. We have 2 minutes left.
Just a quick comment and question. What a cool project. One comment is I wanted to just highlight what I thought was a super cool part of the project, which is how challenging it was to collect that wet period data. Justin mentioned it briefly, but Kinshasa is a massive city, and the data collection could normally take weeks, and it had to be done within 24 to 48 hours during an active flood at a moment's notice on a network that was very disrupted and hard to understand. So, I thought the team did a great job creating the methodology and process even to do that one piece, in addition to your great research. My question, it's kind of a big one, but I'll say it quick. What are the takeaways for policy or interventions? What should Kinshasa do now that we've got this insight? What should other cities do at a policy level?
Yeah, thanks, Clayton. Well, so I think that the two kind of answers on that one. I mean, I think the first one is I think this project is useful because by starting to put a cost on it, and we know we're massively underestimating the cost of disruptions from flooding, right? But to start to put a number on it, first of all, you can actually, it's strengthening the hands of decision makers, right? So that's the first thing. It's like, is this actually an important problem, or is it a not so important problem? And we're actually showing that even for kind of regular flooding after heavy rains, but something that happens potentially every year or multiple times a year, the costs are quite high. So that's the first thing. Then I think the second one, I think the most practical, if you want, policy recommendation that's also coming out of this is what Yiyi just referred to as, was it urban acupuncture? Yeah, I really like that. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, urban acupuncture.
Yeah, no, I think that's great because obviously the investment needs are huge. There are lots of competing priorities. So this idea that you could climate proof the whole of your network is not operational, right? So you really need to kind of start by focusing on the priority areas, those which, when they do get flooded, entail the highest cost to the urban area. So I think that's part of what I think our work is kind of useful for. And doing so not purely, as you were saying, based on just topographic features of the network, but also taking into account the actual travel demand. So it's a combination of critical links because of where they are, but also how they are used.
Great stuff.
Yeah, we have one comment in French. French speaker can help maybe. So I think it's about involving more of a civil society. If the Google Translate is right, our French speaker Esther Ling is having issues with internet, so we have issues responding right now. So thank you for the comments and apologies again for not being able to equip well with the French the audience. We are planning to have like several French webinars, like where then we will for this one when we upload this, it's gonna be we'll make sure the translation is correct for the French version. Thank you for the suggestions.
And just on that one, because it just so happens that I can actually read the French.
Oh, yes, I forgot.
The project in Dar es Salaam is actually, where drones were used. There's also something where the World Bank collaborated. And actually, one of the persons in my unit worked on that, and I completely agree. Right, it was an absolutely fantastic project. I think it's a slightly different object to the one that we're discussing here. Where here we're really focusing on urban transport, whereas I think the project in Dar es Salaam about resilience to flooding was really trying to map the floods at a lowest cost possible, because actually really detailed flood maps can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And using drones to do this was just doing it much more cost effectively, and was also kind of doing it in partnership with the locals. So it wasn't just a kind of top-down exercise. So yeah, completely agree. I mean, I don't think there's a competition between both projects, but this one was the one that's mentioned is certainly a really, really important and cool one.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time, so thanks all for joining. I think the recording should be available next week. We might have to piece the two pieces together. It's recorded twice in a different way. But thank you for joining. And then if you are interested in this kind of webinar presenting your work, I think it's a little bit of a self-plug. So please sign up. This is a monthly webinar series. I will have to reach out to like a targeted people once we run out of speakers. So thank you. And then next month it's going to be March 22nd, and it's going to be about Kisumu in Kenya by ITTP groups, ITTP Africa. So hope to see you, some of you. Thanks, Jackie, for being regular. Thank you all. Have a good day, night. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.